The zeitgeist on net zero is changing. When a historian looks back in the next 10 or 20 years' time to the mid-2020s, my guess is that in retrospect they will see that we moved away from territorial net zero targets and started to get serious about what to do in a world in which the fight against climate change, in as far as it's been focused on reducing emissions, has essentially not been successful. Think where we are. And the basic facts are pretty clear and they're very scary. 1.5 degrees is, as they say, for the birds. We're going through that. We won't officially know for a couple of decades when that historian is writing, but it's pretty obvious that 1.5 degrees and the great hoo-ha at Paris has not actually proved to be a binding target. Indeed, it's pretty unlikely we're going to stop at 2 degrees, and frankly, 3 degrees is on the horizon. 29 COPs have made very little difference, and we're now at 424 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere. India, China, Indonesia are not slowing down on their coal burns. Even if coal peaked, it would still be disastrous in terms of the emissions that are being produced, and so on. So, with this realization that we're not winning the war on climate change, as it's put, that in fact we're going backwards and going backwards at a pretty continuous rate. Actually, last year it was 3 parts per million that carbon concentration in the atmosphere went up, as against the 2 parts per million, which it's been doing for the last 35 years. So what will the new zeitgeist look like that our historian will be writing about 10 or 20 years' time? Well, here are some things which I think are clearly going to be in that agenda. The first is a broad recognition that whilst wind and particular solar in solar-rich areas have a significant part to play, they really are not enough to power a modern electricity system, and one where the demand for electricity is going up and up and up. Put the other way round, solar may have added 2 or 3% to global energy supplies with wind, but there's still 84% down to the fossil fuels, and the renewables are still quite small in comparison with biomass, more generally, particularly old-fashioned biomass, and with nuclear and with big hydro dams. It's a long way to go from 2 to 3% to seriously cutting into the 84% oil, gas and coal, which powers and supports our world economy. And that's not going to change anytime soon. The history that our historian might refer further back to is one in which there aren't any transitions in energy. It will be a miracle if renewables took up the extra demand that will come from the data centers and the new technologies and so on. Just like new technologies in the past have taken up extra demand too. From wood to coal, wood burn goes up. From coal to oil, coal burn goes up. From oil to gas, oil burn goes up. And from gas to renewables, gas demand will go up. That, I think, is the reality we face, and that means that if we rely upon emissions reductions as our strategy to address climate change, we are in for a lot of climate change. So something else has to come into the scene if progress is to be made. And in the last 2-3 years, and it really is 2 or 3 years only, the tide has turned towards nuclear power. Nuclear power is dense energy. It comes in big lumps. It is 24/7 firm power. It is not intermittent power. And it has the capacity to provide a degree of energy security. There are lots of problems with it, but then look at the alternatives. For all the talk of ultra cheap renewables, if you look at the UK, So we used to meet our total demand with about 60 or 70 gigawatts of capacity, and that demand has not yet gone up. But now we need 120 gigawatts of capacity to meet the same demand, and lots of batteries and lots of standby generation and a lot more transmission too. How anyone could think that it's cheaper to have this very large capacity on the system intermittently to produce the same output, which is firm power electricity, for all of us to be sure that when we turn the lights on, they actually work, and for industry to function. How anyone could think that the renewables are 9 times cheaper displays a true inability to see the difference between the marginal cost of a unit added and the system costs of running a whole electricity industry on the basis of so much intermittent power. So nuclear is on the way back. Is it enough? I don't know. I doubt it. But everywhere, it's the new game in town. It's been so in the past, but this time there really are no other options on the table to make big inroads into carbon emissions in electricity generation. A second change in the zeitgeist is on costs and competitiveness. The very point that the renewables as intermittent have increased the cost of energy on the system, not reduced it, and probably will go on doing so, notwithstanding the fact it's very good to have some renewables on the system, has fed through to a recognition that those countries that have gone hardest down the renewables route are the ones with the most expensive electricity. And the UK stands out with the most expensive industrial energy prices in the developed world. Of course, these costs may now be paid by taxpayers rather than industry, or by domestic consumers rather than industry in the new industrial strategy. But that doesn't make the costs go away. They're still there, and they're still a challenge to the UK economy as a whole, even if it's the Exchequer paying, as I recommended in the Cost of Energy Review several years ago. So what? That's the fact of life. And that means that there is a political reality, which is you can go on closing your energy-intensive industries, or rather just not getting any new ones in order to chase down territorial carbon emissions. But you know what? They don't actually make a great deal of difference. So that's number 2. It's right up there now on the agenda, and renewables will have to give ground in order for that cost competitiveness to be met. And again, possibly nuclear comes back into that scene. A third change in the zeitgeist is the recognition that not only are we not going to make net zero by 2030, but it is a pretty absurd target. The idea that you should go flat out for 50 or 60 months in the absence of a supply chain to pay top dollar for whatever the equipment's necessary to meet the target, and to have to somehow manage to coordinate all the parts over that period. That idea is really the sort of things that politicians love, but practical business people don't. And it ain't going to work. It's going to be costly. It isn't going to be well coordinated. And it's best to recognise the reality rather than double down and pay even higher costs over the period. The fourth zeitgeist change is about geoengineering and thinking outside the box. Since it's no longer clear that we're going to be able to get the emissions down globally, and it's only globally that matters, it doesn't matter where a ton of carbon is emitted, since we're not going to achieve this anytime soon, we have to think of more radical measures. And so the new enthusiasm for investigating everything from trying to protect and expand the sea ice in the Arctic through to direct air capture, solar reflectors, and CCS and other ways of sequestrating carbon, these all come to the fore. They're serious now because we may actually need them. That said, virtually no thought has been given to the governance, the control, and the way in which these things might be allowed to develop. So we're going to live with a lot more global warming. We're going to have to put up with that. For some countries like the UK, costs aren't very high in the short term, up to 2 degrees. Actually, for the economy, costs are not that great. Winter deaths will be lower, heat wave deaths will be higher. There will be swings and roundabouts in this frame. But for many parts of the world, this is really serious, and indeed much more serious than it is here. While we're on the way up to 2 degrees, after 2 degrees, well, all the bets are off. So in those contexts, that global perspective, the zeitgeist moves away from asking the question, what can we do in the UK to reduce territorial carbon emissions, to a much more serious question, which is what can we do in the UK to impact on global emissions and global sequestration and make a global difference. Giving every technology a smartie, spreading the jam thinly, however you want to put it, is not a particularly great strategy. And keep banging on about becoming a global energy, clean energy superpower, leading the world, everyone following our example, all that aggrandizement really isn't appropriate to the seriousness of the problems we face. We should spend every buck that we're spending on climate change, on actually addressing climate change, rather than trying to get to net zero territorial production. And while we're at it, we could stop doing some silly things like subsidising dracs, like some of the attempts to think that it's rational to get industry to move to the north coast of Scotland to get close to actually reasonably expensive wind. These experiments are not really that important against the big picture. Spend on global climate change, help to get the marginal emissions down in the best and cheapest place in the world should be our priority. And my guess, when our historian looks back in 20 years' time or whatever, 2050, that dawning recognition that our strategy for the last 10, 20 years, and globally our strategies since 1990 and the 29 COPs, aren't fit for purpose, aren't going to make the difference that have claimed for them, and we do need a plan B. Thank you very much.